19th century philosophy is looking through that transcendental self, the self-consciousness so unified, in order to see reality made in the image of the self. And the image of the self means reality is of the nature of mind or spirit, and so you get 19th century idealism. And then other things emphasizing concrete human experience, organized, unified in various ways. You can see how it's organized for Whitehead by God's superjective nature, coupled with the decision of the new event, which brings things into unity. And you can see how it's organized for Dewey by virtue of the problem situation which is experienced, which brings everything into unity ready for a problem-solving decision. Yes. But when you come to Sartre, it's a different story. And if you like, you find in Sartre the culmination of a process that Charles Taylor, in his recent book on the self, calls the loss of the self. Because the thesis of the transcendence of the ego is that there simply is no transcendental self. There's no unifying core to the self that has any enduring identity. I create myself with every act of thought, with every experience, with every sense perception. I create myself. Now, you say that sounds like a wild idea. Well, maybe it seems so to us. But keep in mind that Sartre is doing phenomenology. And if you like, that's the third reason why I selected this book. That it gives an example of phenomenological description at work. And as you've probably noted, Sartre explicitly interacts with what Husserl has done with regards to the self. Husserl emphasized the intentionality of consciousness. Remember, that was the main theme that came out of his phenomenological work. Intentionality. He tried to bracket consideration of particular objects or particular beliefs and theories so as to examine the universal structures of consciousness so that they could become the objects of what he called eidetic intuition. Kant speaks of them, using another of Husserl's phrases, as phenomenal objects. A phenomenal object is obviously the object that appears. It's an object of thought, not necessarily an independent entity, but what directly appears to the consciousness. So when Husserl brackets out all of the particulars and tries to concentrate on the universal structures of consciousness, of being in the world, that hyphen relationship between subject and object, then that hyphen relationship becomes the phenomenal object. Those structures, those idea, using Plato's term, those universals, become the phenomenal object. Now, intentionality then is involved with reference to external objects in all of our consciousness. But if the external objects are bracketed, what they are in particular is excluded in phenomenological reduction, then the intentionality is directed instead to the phenomenal objects, which Husserl attempts to describe, and of course his description is of the act of intentionality. That's the universal that appears most prominently. Now, Satre is doing phenomenology. He's an existential phenomenologist. So you can anticipate that he's not interested in, not going to be interested in some transcendental self in order to provide a new foundationalism to rescue science from its relativizing tendencies. Remember his concern about the foundations of science. Nor is he going to be like Heidegger, doing a phenomenology of human existence, Dasein, as a key to perceiving Sein, being itself. He's going to do simply a phenomenology of human existence for its own sake, in order to gain this clearer perception of these universal characteristics of human existence, of being in, the hyphen. But rejecting any transcendental ego, all that remains for him to concentrate on is intentionality as such. You'll find that he says that consciousness is nothing but intentionality. Nothing but, if you like, a consciousness meaning or pointing to objects. You see? Consciousness meaning, pointing to, intentional reference to objects. So that you can see why Husserl is often said to tell us that intentionality is a meaning-giving act. A meaning-giving act. Not primarily in the sense that we talk about the meaning of life or the meaning of some political event, but in the sense of attending to, focusing on that object, making it present to us. So the thing becomes a phenomenal object, having meaning for me. Kant's ding for a mick. I pull it into phenomenal status by the intentional act. And in meaning it, it has meaning for me. You think. Now, this means that the self itself is nothing but the act of consciousness. And he develops that in another place, in a little work of his, The Emotions, where he rejects behavioristic psychology outright, by which account the self would simply be a product of environmental causes. Now, he's not going to say that. Nobody after the Kantian Copernican revolution, who agrees with the Copernican revolution, would say that. Behaviorists are pre-Kantian Enlightenment types, as if the self is the passive recipient of these behavioral cause-effect mechanisms, you see. No, rather he's inclined towards a depth psychology. Intentionality is the characteristic of human being, the act of being in the world, towards the world, and emotion simply reveals that. Emotions have intentionality. Emotions are directed towards. You're angry with, hopeful about. You love somebody. You feel sorry for them. Emotion reveals our being in the world, our facticity. It's for that reason that you couldn't even in your wildest dream imagine Satre debating with Descartes whether an external world exists. You see. It's as if he says, I vomit, therefore it exists. It'd be just the experience of being nauseated by something means that the external reality is given in the feeling of nausea. You see. If you've ever been seasick, you know what I mean. There's never any question about the reality of the external world, or the internal world, for that matter. So, by virtue of the intentionality of emotion, our being is being for something, being in relationship to world. The basic term is not I, but I-it. Not subject, but subject-object. That's the basic given, together. Descartes' stove-heated room being an illusory affair. So then, that's the theme and the way in which it relates to Satre0. You'll see it again, and let me pick this up now. You'll see it again if ever you've read his little essay, What is Existentialism? That sometimes is published simply under the title Existentialism. It was a one-lecture thing. It's there that he defines existentialism as saying existence precedes essence. Existence precedes essence. And he's talking particularly about the self. My existence precedes any essence. You see? My existence precedes any essence. I have to create my own nature, my own self. There is no transcendental ego. It's in that essay that he cites Dostoevsky. If God is dead, then anything is possible. But he enlarges it from if God is dead, then anything is possible, to saying if there are no universals,